This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Thank you very much, Hester, and I'm glad to be with you all. Talking about poetry as evidence or how language informs reality. Hearing the panels this morning and keynote address, it's amazing how we seem to cover many of the same things, the idea of logos and meaning, and the idea of prayer and poetry as forms of attention. Listening to Hester speak, several things came to mind, especially my favorite quotation from D.H. Lawrence is that one, art is an act of attention. And it's obviously an ideal definition for prayer as well. Prayer is an act of attention. I was also pleased to hear Hester talking about Auden in relationship at one point there to Oscar Wilde, who seems the least likely person that we could ever invoke at this conference. But in fact, I was only last week rereading The Picture of Dorian Gray, and I came across this quote and I said, hey, there we go. Wilde writes, "The separation of spirit from matter was a mystery. And the union of spirit with matter was a mystery also." How about that? The separation was a mystery, but the union was a mystery as well. Well, now on a more serious quotation, I'm going to begin and end with the man whom Carlyle called the aid and abettor of all who would live in the spirit, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American transcendentalist. If you've never read Nature, his 1836 volume, I'd highly recommend it. It's sort of required reading, certainly for me, required rereading. And he writes, there seems to be, I'm going to crunch this quote just a little bit, because in your interest of time today, I'm going to try to do a lot of crunching here and keep this to about 15 minutes. There seems to be a necessity in spirit there seems to be a necessity in spirit to manifest itself in material forms. A fact is the end or last issue of spirit. The visible creation is the terminus or the circumference of the visible world. And I just think there's a lot to think about there, especially that little nugget. A fact is the end or last issue of the spirit. In my view, poetry and prayer involve an effort that could be likened to incarnation, the putting into words of unspoken things. The expression itself, the utterance, is perhaps the last issue of spirit or its manifestation. Now, the affinities between poetry and prayer seem endless and endlessly fetching. So much so that I choose to proceed with caution here, resisting the easy connections that will tend to lump these unquestionably separate but related forms of thought in possibly less than useful ways. As I began to write this, I happened to be reading for the umpteenth time that idiosyncratic but brilliant work, Some Versions of Pastoral by William Empson, written in 1935. And in the chapter on what he calls double plots, which is really an examination of irony and its discontents, Empson looks closely at Jonathan Swift, who once said, quote, "Everything spiritual is really material." Here's the observation that follows from Empson, and I'm going to scrunch it down a bit because it goes on and on. And Empson, you know how when he goes on and on, it's like a flywheel sweeping you around. And you feel like you've been put through the drying machine in your house. The language plays into his hands here, to Swift's hands, because the spiritual words are all derived from physical metaphors. The spiritual words all come from physical metaphors. As he saw again and again how to do this, the pleasure of ingenuity must have become a shock of faith. He goes on talking about the word spirit, all of the different physical elements that exist, chemical and so forth, natural to the word spirit. I won't go into it now. But Emerson, in his wild associative thinking, riffs on and on about the word spirit. And what lies at the heart of his argument is this nugget of truth I want to hold in the palm of my hand this afternoon. Everything spiritual is really material. There's a distance to cross, nevertheless, between the spiritual and the material. I'd argue that it's only a superficial barrier, a divide that's a more permeable one, this permeable than, say, a hard wall, and that both poetry and prayer are parallel and complementary means for engaging the one side with the other, or a better way to put this, showing that the divide is ultimately false. Poetry is, I would say, a form of incarnation, and prayer operates in much the same way as poetic language, to enhance the physical aspects of spirit, to make the spirit visible in ordinary time. I didn't use that last phrase, ordinary time, carelessly. As you'll know, ordinary time is in the cycle of seasons when there is no obvious or extraordinary point of religious celebration, although one seeks, nevertheless, the kingdom of God that lies within us. What at least in theory prevails during this period of ordinary time is calmness, a sense of quiet and comfortable or possibly discomfiting seeking. This happens in the activities of both poetry and prayer. And that seeking involves what I would call a process of incarnation, a putting of spirit into material terms, a quest to understand and ultimately experience the truth of Swift's statement about spirit and matter. Poets have often played off the connections between spirit and matter in their use of metaphor. Robert Frost understood this connection very well, and he talked at length about metaphor in his various essays. Metaphor is the whole of poetry, he once said. Every poem is a new metaphor, inside or it is nothing. In his essay called Education by Poetry, he wrote, "In late years, I want to go further and further in making metaphor the whole of thinking." In 1959, Frost gave an unknown lecture at the Bremond School of English in Vermont, where I teach. And he talked about his sense that so much of what he had spent his life doing was trying to allow spirit to penetrate into matter. He said, quote, and Frost has this rambling way of talking that I love. You sound like you think he's about to fall off a cliff and he keeps rescuing himself. But it's always rambling round and round. He says, the great enterprise of our race is our penetration into matter, deeper and deeper, carrying the spirit deeper into matter. And though it looks like something different out in space, that's just deeper into matter. That's material penetration of the spirit, of the ethereal into the material. Put it that way, and that is our destiny. That is why science is our greatness. And it's got to do with the penetration of spirit into matter. Love that. Spirit, of course, as Emerson keeps telling us in that phrase I didn't quote fully, has its roots in spiritus, meaning wind or breath. It's a physical thing, not something airy or far away. Matter is another thing, perhaps. Its root relates to mater, origin, source, and of course, mother. Are we perhaps looking at two sides of the same coin when we refer to the spiritual and the material? Trying to sort out the differences here have, of course, absorbed and troubled philosophers from, and we've known a lot about this today, from Kant and Fichte and Schelling and Hegel through Emerson, William James, and so forth. Often without much luck in the work of disentanglement. I would note here parenthetically that Hegel regarded his own philosophical efforts as an attempt to clarify the movement by which the rational becomes real. That is, he imagined history as the process of the absolute becoming increasingly self-manifest as an incarnate logos, as it infiltrates and indeed creates human consciousness through language. Poetry and prayer, on the other hand, seem to work in very different ways from philosophy. These forms of thought challenge the disentanglement of spirit and matter as a proper goal. The work of poetry in Frost's aesthetic involves the pressing of spirit into matter, of making them one, and it does so through the almost mystical operations of metaphor, this carrying over, in which one thing stands in for another or even merges them. This work is what I mean by language as incarnation. Needless to say, the concept's deep theological underpinnings, as in the Gospel of John, are where we read, "And the Word was made flesh." The word here, of course, is logos, and by the 4th century, the Latin word incarnatio had become a term of common use among the church fathers, such as Jerome, Ambrose, Hilary, and so forth. The concepts in both Latin and Greek were meant to suggest a reifying motion, at once physical and spiritual, as meaning itself, logos, probably the most suggestive and difficult concept in Western thought, takes flesh in language and ultimately in the person of Jesus, who becomes the human face of God. Poets have wrestled with the concept of logos and incarnation over the centuries, as it's a central aspect of the poetic enterprise. And the questions become, how does poetry embody spiritual truth? And how does the language of poetry function in this regard? One sees various attempts and criticism to come to terms with these questions or problems. Modern critics have often focused on poetic language as an opaque medium. And in the age of post-structuralist readings, we commonly think of the huge gap between signifier and signified. The word as elegy to what it represents, and with an attendant sense of loss, as language tries and fails to conjure or embody realities of one kind or another. This critique of poetic language has led to a view of poetry as a system of self-referential signs, with an emphasis on wordplay or even graphic design. Such a poetics plays off the more traditional view, where language is a window that one looks through, viewing the material world or some mystical truth, perhaps. In this vein, the poet's job is to apprehend realities in his or her special way and simply communicate them. There's no doubt that language, poetic language in particular, is more than a medium of communication. If you look at Hopkins, for instance, his poems assemble in a dense, euphonious, image-crammed substance, a material in itself, like stone for a sculptor or paint for a painter. It's pointing to itself as much as beyond itself. In this, I'd say, it seems very like a language of incarnation. That is, it creates a language that enacts repeatedly the incarnation itself, as in the famous poem, as kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, which is that wonderful line, "For Christ plays in 10,000 places." I've been a long admirer of Hopkins' journals, and I often return to that passage from May of 1870, where he says, "I do not think I have ever seen anything more beautiful than the bluebell I have been looking at, and I know the beauty of our Lord by it." That's, of course, a breathtaking leap from bluebell to our Lord. But it's thrilling as Hopkins continues in his usual exacting way, describing these impossibly beautiful flowers, suggesting that their, quote, inscape is mixed of strength and grace. And by inscape, of course, he means the sense in which God allows nature to play in the world in 10,000 places, to open or expand in a unique way in each thing in the world, whether animal, mineral, or human. It's a process of animation, of putting soul into things that compels Hopkins' attention. Especially in poets with a spiritual drive, from Donne and Herbert through Hopkins, Eliot, and so forth, one senses a deep kinship between the work of poetry and the work of prayer. In Eliot's Dry Salvages, for instance, he comes as close to perfection he comes as close to a perfect understanding of this kinship as anywhere in poetry that I know about. The poet, he says, I'll just quote this favorite passage of mine, probably in all modern poetry. The point of the poet, he says, is to apprehend the point of intersection of the timeless with time is an occupation for the saint. No occupation either, but something given and taken in a lifetime's death and love. Ardor and selflessness and self-surrender, for most of us, there is only the unattended moment, the moment in and out of time, the distraction lost in a shaft of sunlight, the wild time unseen, with a winter lightning, with a waterfall, or music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. These are only hints and guesses, hints followed by guesses, and the rest is prayer, observance, discipline, thought, and action. The hint half guessed, the gift half understood is incarnation. Eliot might have said that the way toward incarnation involves the 5 activities that he cites: prayer, observance, discipline, thought, action. I would suggest that poetic incarnation, finding the words to embody spiritual things, the deeper and deeper penetration of spirit into matter, connect deeply with the activities of prayer and observation, if not observance, even discipline and thought. And action, as it were, becomes the performance of the writing itself. Both poetry and prayer seek incarnation as a fleshing out of the spirit with imagery, sound, texture, and cadence. And one thinks back to the connections between poetry and meditation here, as when Ignatius invites us to summon a concrete image at the beginning of all prayer or meditation, the act of compositio loci, composition of place. To contemplate the image with all of our intellectual resources as we move toward effective prayer, seeking a relationship with God. Both poetry and prayer, I would suggest, function in a daily way in ordinary time to gather and transmute the spirit, the wind, the breath, into a linguistic medium that both holds and spells or enchants. This enchantment is the goal of the exercise, in that poetry and prayer lead us to levels of awareness as the poet or contemplative moves into God's presence, making a bid for grace. I use the word bid here self-consciously, thinking of the Anglo-Saxon root word bed. The word for prayer in German, of course, is beten, or in Dutch it's bidden. These words are all cognates of bid in English. And one hears this deep philological echo in Hopkins again in his great poem about prayer. Patience, hard thing, the hard thing but to pray, but bid for, patience is. Patience who asks once war, once wounds. So Hopkins asks us to bid for the patience to pray. And he complicates the term with the phrase, we do bid God bend to him, even so. We do bid God bend to him, even so. That is, we put in a bid, a request to God. We ask that our souls bend to his. We look for this conjunction, which is granted in 2 ways. It's granted in the poem itself, which gives flesh to spirit, which summons the material world in a way that does not separate spirit and matter. And the prayer moves in similar ways. A bid for God's ear, a hankering to listen, a connection in which incarnation itself is manifest in what Hopkins calls as patience fills his crisp combs. In summary, the affinities between poetry and prayer lead us to a fresh sense of poetic language as the embodiment of spirit or soul. Nature is the symbol of spirit, as Emerson has suggested. And so I'll end again with Emerson. So language becomes the means by which spirit and nature, or the material world, engage. That engagement in the mind of the poet or the person in prayer opens toward that paradise within us, happy or far, that Milton writes about in Paradise Lost, where it's akin to what Emerson aspired to understand in his essay on what he called the Oversoul, where he writes, "One mode of the divine teaching is the incarnation of the spirit in a form." So poetry and prayer are 2 of these forms, and I would argue they amplify and sustain each other.
Thank you very much to both our speakers for interesting and stimulating papers, talks. We have a few minutes for questions, and as I said, we have a a wandering microphone. You don't want to be asked. You don't want to ask questions now that you can be heard.
Thank you for that. I thought it was very persuasive and very beautifully expressed. But how would it be if just for a minute I was be a devil's advocate?
Please, be the devil. I love it.
A devil, indeed.
Okay.
What are we going to say then about? What are we going to say to someone who says, "Well, yes, I can see and go along with what you've said so far, but I would myself be inclined to say," this is the devil speaking, yes, I myself would be inclined to say that whereas prayer, in some sense, is happy to settle and wishes to settle and wishes to move into and wishes to lose itself in, perhaps, the ineffable, the unspeakable, the unknowable, because these things, in an order of experience by which we're completely transcended. Whereas poetry, as surely one of its definite finalities, wishes in some sense to crystallize the experience in the word, so that the word becomes the form, the definite, the certainty, the definitive expression of a state of mind. And in that sense, in the sense of prayer being moving on into the other, but poetry wishing in some sense to secure the here and now, that they do not overlap. In fact, they are quite different kinds of undertaking. What are we to say to someone who says that?
I would say that to that person, you're far too wedded to that old Popian version of poetry, what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. And that is a very common image for what a poet does. Takes, airy nothings, gives a local habitation, right? A common language and a name, whatever, the Shakespearean idea. This is a very common view of poetry. But I think anyone who has spent a lot of time with poetry knows, yes, it's wonderful the way poetry can suddenly, suddenly put into words things we hadn't thought before, and can crystallize feelings and thoughts. But really, that's more the work of philosophy, in my view. And in fact, poetry, as with prayer, often is involved in the mysteries and in opening. I mean, as someone was talking in the panel this morning, I thought it was very well expressed about the poet and the person in prayer are standing at the point of listening, and are at that moment which is often tragic, where you're not sure where you're going. And I love poetry that in fact, far from resolving my sense of things, Eliot would be a poet like this, Hopkins, far from Dante, whom you work on, these are not poets who necessarily just simply express something very well. We go, that's it, and I've got it in a box, and I put it right there on the table. I think rather the great poems lead us into areas of mystery and question and put us into contact with God in a way that is absolutely tragic and thrilling. I would have added to the gentleman this morning who said that poetry has that tragic aspect. I would also, there's a line in the great atheist poet, Wallace Stevens, who I think was hardly an atheist. I think he's one of the great spiritual writers of the 20th century. He says the gaiety of language is our Seigneur. And I think by Seigneur, he has to mean God. And that gaiety of language is the kind of unpredictability of the linguistic medium. And it's, I think we're slipping through the cracks as we read poetry all the time. And the poetry is in the places in between the words, right? As Frost said, poetry is what gets lost in translation. And I think as poets, readers of poetry, and as people in prayer, we're perpetually lost. And I think that's what and I would say at its very highest levels, both poetry and prayer meet in the spaces in between. And I think when we slip through the cracks, we're slipping into a brilliant light or a very great darkness or a void. And I think those are the places where the affinities interest me, and not so much in the kind of old classical view of poetry as simply perfect expression of some thought. I seem to have silenced all of you.
Francesca?
There's a question.
Francesca.
Well, I was just going to say, apropos of that last discussion, that a speaker I heard recently on contemplative prayer, by which he meant hesychast prayer, the silent prayer, said that any prayer has to do two things. One is it's like a pebble dropping into a pool. It goes deep down the stone, but then the ripples go out wide. And so you do have both the concentration and the crystallization and the stilling on the one perfect, whatever, the notion that you have finished. But you have ripples which go out and hit who knows what shores. And you have to have both, was what he was calling.
Well, it's in the nature of the symbol to be both specific but also unspecific, to have ripples of association. And I think that's where both are involved in symbolic thinking. That's right. Another question? An objection?
I was just thinking about Bremond because Heythrop brought him up before. And I think he made that distinction between poetry, which is directed to others, whereas prayer very often is not, well, it can be communion prayer, but it's your personal prayer to God. So maybe the poet is, in a way, interested, at least partly, in communicating something to others. It becomes a mystery to others as well, but I mean, perhaps it's that direction. A poet wants to communicate
Yes,
to
I can see
others.
that.
And someone who prays has got a personal relationship with God. I don't know, just...
No, I think that's a clear distinction. Poetry and prayer are not the same thing. So I think you're right. I think you've marked a good distinction there. The poet is communicating. You are writing poetry presumably for other people to read, whereas no one is praying for anyone except your own relationship with God. So that's a very, very different kind of thing. But again, prayer often depends on poetry. So means really, so often prayers are poems.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm hesitant to take up any more time than where my own talk kind of filled my half an hour, but I just come in at that point, if I might, and say I was very struck by how Bremond quite clearly distinguished the two, didn't he, and said that actually poetry is a lesser thing than prayer because of its desire to communicate. I think those of us who work with poetry would sometimes see it the other way, that communication is central. We've heard some very kind of convincing accounts of that this morning, but Bremond seems to be saying that in the desire to share and to even sell what he has to say, the poet's grasp of substantial truth is diminished and lost. And that in a way, that the more in touch with the real he is, the less he desires to communicate it.
On the other hand, Eliot answered Bremond saying, no, the poet actually does not want to communicate. So, but,
Time is passing, and I think we need to stop there because we've got quite a tight timetable, and we're breaking up. We're scheduled anyway to have two sessions, two short paper panels between now 2:45 and 4:15. So once again, thanks to our speakers for their contributions this afternoon.